For God's sake, don't insult Mandela. The Trump administration has, in a sense, set itself up or positioned itself as the protector of white interests. Because the rules of war and international law, as it later developed into, regulate how European nations or nations of the global north related to each other. So for South Africa, no, we always from 1994 insisted. In 2023, this came to a head. This was an opportunity to say this properly on the global stage, that international law and the international legal system is ours too. But I have to introduce you at this point to a famous South African actor here. Joel Pollack actually tweeted about her. I would get these young Zionists who would say things like, if only the Palestinians followed Mandela's example. For God's sake, don't insult Mandela.
Welcome to the FloodGate podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. We are here to engage with today's most pressing issues and unpack them beyond the cliches of mainstream media. I'm your host, Ramzi Baroud, and with me is the brilliant Romano Rubio, an Italian journalist and the managing editor of the Palestine Chronicle. Today's guest is Mr. Naeem Jeenah, one of South Africa's most respected academics, activists, and community leaders.
Mr. Jeenah is currently a senior researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection and was previously the executive director of the Afro-Middle East Center, a research institute dedicated to studying the Middle East and North Africa. He also worked as director at the Operations for the Freedom of Expressions Institute in Johannesburg and was a lecturer in political studies at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He is the author of several books, including Pretending Democracy, Israel, an Ethnocratic State. Mr. Jeenah, it's an honor to have you with us, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Ramzi. Thank you, Romana.
Naeem, let me start from the very end here, and that is South Africa's ambassador to the US, Mr. Ibrahim Rasool, was recently expelled by the Trump administration. I mean, honestly, despite of everything that the Trump administration has been doing, many people were still taken by surprise. Could you help us understand the reasons behind this? Was it related to Mr. Rasool personally because of his strong and solid position on Palestine throughout the years, or was it a reflection of South Africa's stance on Palestine as a government?
So my view is that it's not related directly to Ibrahim Rasool. Ibrahim spoke at a webinar that the organization I work for, MISTRA, the Mapungubwe Institute, hosted, looking at 50 days of the Trump administration and what it meant for South Africa and for the African continent. And one paragraph of his speech was reproduced in an article by an ex-South African right-winger and racist, frankly, Joel Pollack, who was angling to become the ambassador to South Africa, this time as well as the first Trump presidency, and didn't get it then and didn't get it now. He wrote an article on Breitbart, this now infamous, notorious right-wing website, where he quoted one paragraph of what Ibrahim had to say, and referred to it as race baiting. On the basis of that article, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, issued his famous now tweet declaring Ibrahim persona non grata. My view is that it's, frankly, it doesn't matter who South Africa sends as an ambassador to the United States. The treatment he or she will receive will be the same. Well, maybe it might be a little different if the person is white and Afrikaner, but the treatment will generally be the same. And the reason for that is that this is not about Ibrahim Rasool. This is about South Africa. I mean, before Ibrahim Rasool gave that speech and addressed that webinar that we organized, Trump had already issued his executive order against South Africa, in terms of which he stopped all aid to South Africa, and we can speak a little about that issue of aid to South Africa. He stopped all aid to South Africa, and he announced that basically white Afrikaners in South Africa were persecuted and therefore were eligible to get refugee status in the US. In that executive order, he gave two reasons for why he's taken that position. One reason was this, ridiculous propaganda notion by a section of white right-wingers in South Africa that there's a white genocide taking place in South Africa, that certain new laws, such as the Expropriation Act, is stealing land from and property from white people, etc., etc. And so, as Trump said, terrible things are happening in South Africa. And the second reason was South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, the genocide case against Israel. So he said clearly these were the two reasons. So South Africa is in the American crosshairs. I mean, recently he said something about setting up refugee camps in South Africa for these, poor whites who are getting persecuted. Whites in South Africa, by the way, own about 85% of the wealth of the country, close to 90% of the land of the country is owned by whites. So, there are many people around the world who would love to be persecuted in that way.
Let me just follow up quickly on this, Naeem. I mean, it seems to me, and I might be wrong on this one, that the reason is actually Palestine. I mean, this is something that is done on behalf of pro-Israeli groups and Zionist groups in the U.S. to kind of, kind of send a message to anyone who dares defy Israel and the U.S. at international institutions that there will be accountability. And they are using this, the persecuted whites of South Africa as a pretense because, as you stated and as it is well known, the whites of South Africa are hardly or are not in the least oppressed. And he's just kind of waving this card, as if he is threatening that I am capable of creating civil strife in the country. Will that be an kind of appropriate assessment, or do you really think that aside from Israel, there is a separate agenda going on in South Africa?
No, I think there is a separate agenda. Look, and here I agree with the comment that got Ibrahim Rasool into trouble. And that is that the Trump administration has, in a sense, set itself up or positioned itself as the protector of white interests, certainly in the United States. This whole thing about DEI, etc. And now, his announcement that he's going to punish foreign companies that operate in the US that have any kind of DEI policies. So this whole anti-DEI thing means the kind of positioning as the protector of white interests in the US, but also globally. So, the deputy president of the United States going to speak at a conference in Germany and lauding and defending the extreme right-wing party in Germany, the AfD, or Nigel Farage in the UK. And similarly, in South Africa, in a sense, is a poster child for DEI as far as those around Trump might be concerned. So it's that white supremacist kind of agenda that South Africa goes against. Then added to that, before we come to the Israel issue, added to that is the fact that a number of people that surround Trump are ex-South Africans. So, the most famous, of course, is Elon Musk, an ex-South African whose family benefited from apartheid, defended apartheid, and now gives Nazi salutes and establishes himself as that kind of thing, as defending apartheid and worse. His father said I know that he and his father don't have a great relationship, so we shouldn't take anything his father says seriously, but it's an indication of where he grew up. His father said that the notion that Elon Musk is racist is ridiculous because he had lots of contact with their black servants. This was his statement, right? So it's Musk, it's that PayPal guy, and Joel Pollack, the guy who wanted to be ambassador, who wrote the Breitbart article. These are the people that kind of orbit around Trump. So while in general it's an it's a pro-white or defending white interest thing, which means all African countries would be in his crosshairs, but South Africa is particularly in its crosshairs because, number one, it has a white population that is substantial, 7 or 8%, but that's substantial, 7 or 8% who own 85% of the wealth. And secondly, that some of these white South Africans are around him. And then, of course, as you say, there's a strong pro-Israeli lobby in the US and around Trump. And the Israeli, the pro-Zionist kind of narrative is the fascist narrative that the Trump administration pushes. So these two together, South Africa satisfies two of the big agenda items.
And indeed, South Africa's position on Palestine was already strong, but has grown increasingly active over the years. As you mentioned, South Africa has led efforts at the International Court of Justice regarding Israel's genocide in Gaza. So while we all know that there always has been a very special bond between the two struggles, why do you think the country has taken such a strong stand, even paying a price, one that even surpasses positions taken, for example, by some Arab countries?
I feel insulted that you compare us to Arab countries, but, to Arab states anyway. No, this is a question that many people have asked, and even asked in a way, why has South Africa suddenly been so vociferous? We know that they've been pro-Palestinian, but it's not as sudden as it seems. So let me very quickly look at, from 1994, our first democratic election. So what the position of democratic South Africa has been on the Palestinian issue. So South Africa, firstly, the South African government, the ANC-led government in 1994, inherited a whole range of international relations and took them on board and didn't mess with them, didn't disrupt them, except for the recognition of Taiwan. Everything else remained as it was, including relations with Israel. Even though we know that Israel had military, intelligence, nuclear links with South Africa. And the nuclear weapons, Israel's nuclear weapons and South Africa's nuclear weapons were developed jointly. South Africa, of course, destroyed them in 1989. But the new South African government adopted those relations, believing that no relations are bad in a sense, and so let's keep them on. That then moved to a position where South Africa saw itself, or saw the possibility of it mediating between Palestinians and Israelis. This mediation was something that the ANC and the South African government were very keen on in various parts of Africa. And let me say that in that first decade or so, in little over a decade in South Africa, in terms of foreign policy, there were seven top priority areas for South Africa. 6 of them were on the African continent, the whole thing of South Africa being part of the African, and the 7th one was Palestine. So it was always important. But this notion that South Africa could play a mediating role saw South Africa then, from around 1998, begin a whole different kind of relationship with Israel. Bringing down Likud party people to South Africa, getting them to meet people from the PA, bringing down former generals or generals from the Israeli occupation forces to meet South African Defense Force generals from the past, hoping that, the South African guys will tell them, look, we saw the writing on the wall, you should too, that kind of thing. So there was this whole initiative around this attempted mediation. In 2004, because the criticism, of course, from the Zionist lobby and from the Israelis was, well, it's great that you want to play a mediating role, and we're all for it, but you're too close to the Palestinians. You're not even-handed. You're not balanced. Because in 1995, we opened a Palestinian embassy. South Africa recognized the state of Palestine, opened a Palestinian embassy in South Africa. So in 2004, as part of the attempt to be even-handed, we signed a trade agreement with Israel. And from then, and a 10-year agreement, from 2004 until 2012, there was an increase in trade in each direction, in both directions, of around 7 or 8% year on year, right? So things were, the relationship was actually improving with Israel. Of course, Israel wasn't interested in any kind of mediation. I mean, why should you be if you got the United States on your side? Worry about a country like South Africa. But in 2012, that relationship started, I almost said going south, but that's that's a terrible term to use. That relationship started souring a little. 2012 was by mid 2012, you had two major onslaughts against Gaza. 2008, 2009, March, I think 2012, and you know, there was this global kind of anger, concern, and that played itself out in South Africa and the solidarity movement within the ANC, etc. So there was a decision taken by the ANC, not by government. Because these two things are separate. A decision taken by the ANC to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign in December 2012. At the same time, there was agitation from the solidarity movement in South Africa, concern about the number of delegations from South Africa that were visiting Israel. So we had ANC Youth League delegations, for example, being taken there. We had delegations of local police going there for training. We had business people being taken over for management training, you know, as if we
You know, just a quick note here about they were taken. I mean, it seems that there is a branch within the ANC, not just the government, that actually does want to normalize with Israel, but another branch kind of fighting against that. Is that correct?
So of course the word normalization is wrong, because we do have relations. So
But like
there's a small
further normalized
faction.
meaning, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So there is a small faction. It's small. It's been there for a while. It was growing bigger. I mean, with the ANC Youth League thing, for example, there was a particular attempt to get at younger ANC members, and people who didn't have the history of ANC people in exile, who, you know, fraternized with and trained with the PLO and all of that. And for a while it did work. And then there was this business thing. Local Zionists, South African Zionists, involved in business, who tried to pull in business people within the ANC. So that was a very deliberate and very smart attempt. In the early 90s, I should just say, before we had our first democratic elections that the ANC won, there was a joke that the Israeli ambassador at the time, Alon Liel, who now you might know, Alon is a anti-occupation activist. He and his successor in South Africa, Ilan Baruch, both left the foreign ministry and set up a new organization. You know, Alon, I spoke with him at one seminar in South Africa a few years ago, and he started off by saying, I have always believed in a two-state solution. I believe in a two-state solution, and I will always believe in a two-state solution. But a two-state solution is not possible. So we need to talk about what a one-state solution looks like. So I'm not saying he's not a Zionist, or you know, but that's his kind of positioning. So the joke about Alon Liel in the early 90s was that he spent more time at Shell House, which was the ANC headquarters, than he did in Pretoria. So there was lots of lobbying of the ANC that took place. So in 2012, the late Ibrahim, who at the time was deputy foreign minister, then as a result of this kind of agitation, then issued or made a declaration that government officials and ANC officials will no longer be allowed to visit Israel unless it is to further the peace process. No one really knew what that meant, but or if they were diplomats at the embassy. From 2012, then, the relationship started getting more difficult with Israel. Trade started dropping quite drastically from that high point in 2012. The delegations stopped that were going back and forth. In 2014, when that trade agreement lapsed, neither side was interested in renewing it. And so that kind of new approach started taking hold. There were two other things that also happened in the ANC. One was there started being a discussion about, even though the official government position is that that we take a position that is a multilateral one, etc., and hence we support a two-state solution, is the government position. But within the ANC, there was talk about, well, we should start talking about a one-state solution. Is it something that we should be supporting? The ANC won't just take such a decision because they were the governing party at the time. Now they're part of a government. The other thing that started happening in the ANC, and from a little before 2012, from around 2008 or thereabouts, and actually from 2006. 2006 was when Hamas won the election in the Palestinian territories, and South African president at the time, Thabo Mbeki, publicly invited Ismail Haniyeh to visit as the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, or the state of Palestine. So there was a shift within the ANC to say that maybe we were wrong. Maybe we need to expand our relations beyond Fatah/PA/PLO. And we need to listen to other
If you
Palestinian
don't mind me, Naeem, just because this is very important, this shift that you speak about, because as you know, I visited South Africa several times, and I've been to every major city there. I do remember during my early visits, and there's this debate that or this notion among intellectuals, academics, and some politicians within the ANC and beyond the ANC that kind of argued, we can't be holier than the king. I mean, look at the position of the Palestinian Authority. They are normalizing with Israel. They want us to normalize with Israel. Look at the position of other Arab countries, which eventually led to, outright normalization. And you expect South Africa to have this position that is radical beyond the people who should be the most protective of the Palestinian cause. What happened during that time? You spoke about Ibrahim, then Mbeki himself, and they began taking a radical position that was not even, embraced by the official representation of the Palestinians, which is the Palestinian Authority. What caused that shift?
So yes, of course, you visited every major and quite a few minor cities as well, if I remember correctly, Ramzi. So I think 2006 was a big shift, the election. There was, so just as an indication, Ibrahim, Allah yarhamhu, he in 2004, and he was a good friend, in 2004 at a UN conference in Cape Town. It was a government and civil society conference, a UN conference, and many from the Solidarity movement were there. There were sharp debates, and at one point he stood up and he said, all these people who are talking about a one-state solution, these are Hamas supporters. I think some of our PFLP supporters were a bit upset, but these are Hamas supporters. And if there was an election in Palestine tomorrow, Hamas will get 2% of the vote. 2 years later, they won the election. Right. And so it was a wake-up call. And at the same time, there was, or just after that, 2008, the ambassador who was posted to Damascus began opening up relations with all the Palestinian factions who were there. And so the messages coming back were, these guys are important. Even the small ones, the two men and a fax machine guys are important to listen to. And so there was a sense that we got it wrong. And then, as you remember, Ramzi, there was always this thing, well, the Arab League says this, the Arab League, and we can't be, as you say, better than the Arab. This also comes from the kind of idea of our struggle, where the one apart from the liberation movement itself, the ANC and the PAC, those who spoke authoritatively about the South African struggle were, number one, the frontline states, the African countries surrounding South Africa, and secondly, the Organization of African Unity. This was our kind of strategic depth. And so that translated into the South African mind in the same way. So for Palestine, the frontline states, what do they say? We have to listen to them, because in the United Nations, the voice of the OAU was the voice of the anti-apartheid movement. But 2006, when the party you are supporting loses an election, it's a big wake-up call, right? But formally, the relationship still was from government with the PA, from the ANC with supposedly the PLO, but in reality Fatah, right? So I remember, for example, this was around 2011, 2012 maybe. Ibrahim, I can now say this because there's no political repercussions for him. Ibrahim contacted me. I was the executive director of AMEC, the Afro-Middle East Center at the time. And he said, look, don't you guys want to bring down Mustafa Barghouti to South Africa? So I said, well, we've been talking about this for a while, and I've met him, raised it with him, and he said, no, we want to meet with him. But the last time that we invited him, so of course, from government, if you invite a politician from another country, you inform the embassy. So they informed the embassy, and the embassy said, no, the only people you can bring down are people through the embassy, and so Fatah people. So his thing was, if AMEC brought Mustafa down, it would be fine, and then they can have their own. So we brought him down. He did the same kind of tour that you did, Ramzi, not the minor cities though. He wasn't as generous as you were to go to the rural areas. And while he was here, he had a meeting in Pretoria with Ibrahim and others from the foreign ministry, and he had a meeting in Johannesburg with Ibrahim and others from the ANC. So he met both the party and he met government, and without government taking any responsibility for his being here. Right. This was, in a sense, a precursor to a later, some might say, much more important visit. And that was the delegation in 2015, the Hamas delegation led by Khalid Mish'al, who at the time was the head of Hamas. 5 or 6, I think 5 members of the Hamas Politburo, with other officials, like a 20-person delegation who came here, had a much bigger meeting with the ANC's top 6 at the time, signed a memorandum with the ANC, and that then indicated, so it wasn't government, but it was the ANC. And that gave the indication that the ANC was now broadening its relations with Palestinian parties to other groups as well. But even before that, there was talk that began in ANC circles, prompted by those in civil society, that after that 2012 souring of relations with Israel, that what South Africa should be doing is not try to rehash this mediation nonsense. That South Africa's role is to support Palestinians in the struggle against Israeli apartheid, colonialism, and occupation. And one way of doing that is to bring Palestinian groups together. And so there was this attempt a few times in different ways to facilitate, however they might be able to, some kind of Palestinian reconciliation or whatever you might call it. So there was a delegation of kind of ex-officials from government to Beirut. That was organized by the Afro-Middle East Center. There was a conference in Beirut on Palestinian reconciliation, and on the sidelines of the conference, they met with representatives of Hamas, Fatah, Hezbollah, etc. And then there was a separate track where representatives of these of a whole range of groups, including from within 48. Were brought to Cape Town, and they had so not under the auspices of the government separately, but government people, ANC people were there, etc. So it was a slow process, Ramzi, that led to that point. And so this also feeds into your question, Rumana, about this. So coming up to 2023. this notion that we must follow the Arabs or we must follow the PA, that had by then kind of fallen by the wayside. It was now clear to people in the ANC that the Arabs, meaning Arab states, were not really that keen on the Palestinian struggle, and were, some of them actually undermining the Palestinian struggle. That the PA was not the legitimate and sole representative of the Palestinian people as they would like to pretend to be. And so South Africa needs to decide on its own on its foreign policy on this issue, number one. And this also comes from the experience around the African Union. You remember when Israel was 2014, was it? When Israel was, no, a bit later, 2018 or something, when Israel was accepted as an observer member in the African Union, very kind of under the table and all of that. And South Africa protested against it. South Africa, in a sense, led a lobby together with Namibia and Algeria in the African Union to try and get Israel out. In the initial period, immediately after this thing became news, the members of the Palestinian leadership in the Palestinian Authority said to the South Africans, no, leave it. Don't upset this. So did the Egyptians, by the way. And I think this added to, for at the time, Naledi Pandor was the minister, but for our Department of International Relations and Cooperation, the African Union is our thing, right? And accepting Israel means kind of us as Africans supporting apartheid. And the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights is quite clear, not only about Israel, but about Zionism, regarding it as racism. So as Africans, we can't accept this. And so whether some Arab country says so or not, with Egypt, it is an African country as well, so it makes it more difficult. But, and so again, this thing that we need to have our own foreign policy. And then, of course, the last thing around the ICJ thing is that the sense by 2023, we all had the sense of how international law is manipulated, how international law is kind of, has been and was designed as the preserve for northern states, for European states, essentially. I mean, the rules of, I always say that while Europeans had agreed on something called the rules of war to regulate how they fought between themselves, basically, the Germans committed a genocide in my neighborhood, in Namibia, 2 genocides at the beginning of the 20th century. Right? And they were talking about the rules of, because the rules of war and international law, as it later developed into, and the rules-based order after the Second so-called World War, all of these things were meant to regulate how European nations or nations of the global north related to each other. It wasn't meant for uncivilized people. Uncivilized people were just had to be put in their place. Now, so for South Africa, no, we always from 1994 insisted there must be a reform of the international system. There must be multilateralism. International law applies to us all. In 2023, this came to a head. This was an opportunity to say this properly on the global stage, that international law and the international legal system is ours too, that we can also use it. And that's what South Africa did. So it was partly about Palestine, it was partly about international law and the global south, and that's what we saw in December 2023.
And I feel that, this clash between the global north and the global south, South Africa not only led the legal initiative, but also at a grassroots level, events of solidarity and movements of solidarity. So do you think that, somehow we managed to reach a critical mass and to have that shift in the global awareness and global consciousness throughout this genocide with, these actions?
No, absolutely, we did. I don't, I think we should be a little careful. I don't think that South Africa was a leader in that, in terms of the mass mobilization. South Africa also always symbolically is important for the Palestinian struggle. But in terms of mass mobilization, we put to shame by many other countries. So we were not a leader in terms of that. The South African voice is always by Palestinians amplified for good reason, because of the similarities between the oppressive systems that we underwent and Palestinians do now. Although, of course, we never had a genocide in South Africa or genocidal intentions. We never had bombs dropped in our townships. We didn't have even tanks in our townships. So in terms of the scale of repression and the intent in South Africa, it was never the case to get rid of black people. Black people were very important to apartheid, because without black people the economy would just collapse. But in the Palestinian context, the attempt is to get rid of Palestinians. So symbolically, South Africa is important, and our voices, Palestinians like to amplify with good reason, and we're happy to allow our voices to be amplified. But we're not the most active in terms of the protests and campaigns, etc. But yes, now we have a much more active solidarity movement in South Africa than before 2023. One example, and it's not the main example necessarily, but a good example, is we have an organization in South Africa called South African Jews for Free Palestine. Before October 2023, SAJFP was a handful of activists who struggled, worked very hard to pull off, low-profile actions, got slammed by many others in the Jewish community for selling out, and because the South African Jewish community is very Zionist, more than the US, to be clear, in terms of per capita, etc. But now SAJFP is an important voice, and the numbers that pitch up at the weekly anti-genocide Shabbat or the protests that they have, etc., has increased manifold. So the genocide of the past year and a half has certainly turned a lot of people who are on the fence and made their positions clearer. And broadly in the Black South African community, broadly there's very strong support for Palestine.
So if we could just take a short detour to talk about geopolitics. I mean, where does South Africa, kind of gets this? I mean, you spoke about the symbolic importance of South Africa, which doesn't seem to matter to Trump in the least, but it seems that there is this certain kind of power and gusto that comes from South African political action. We know it's an increasingly important global player, particularly within the BRICS group, but also beyond that. It also achieves a lot of its legitimacy as a political player from its leadership within the African continent, and so forth. Do you think that the country is at this stage in a vulnerable position because of its support for Palestine? Or is it growing stronger, more independent as it seeks new alliances beyond its traditional reliance on Western support and validation? How would you describe the current relationship between South Africa on the one hand and the US and Western powers on the other, especially in the light of recent events?
So in a sense, it's a bit of both, but I have to introduce you at this point to a famous South African actor here. Joel Pollack actually tweeted about her in a nasty way. So she's now attained more fame than I have. So South Africa is vulnerable. Right, South Africa is vulnerable mainly because our economy is not as strong as we would like it to be. Our main challenges for years now is the level of inequality in South Africa, the deepening poverty, some of which you saw, Ramzi, in some of the places that we went to in South Africa. unemployment that feeds into that poverty and inequality. So these are very strong developmental challenges, very deep. We have an economy that's not able to deal with these in the next few years, and we have to work on that. So from that perspective, South Africa is vulnerable, right? But at the same time, South Africa is less vulnerable than many other states, certainly for the United States, where the United States is concerned, as well as the fact that one of the consequences of the South African case at the ICJ is the number of global South states that have rallied around South Africa, rallied for the Palestinian or against the genocide of Palestinians, but rallied around South Africa. And so politically, diplomatically, South Africa has been strengthened in the past year and a half. On the vulnerability part, let me say this. The United States is our second largest trading partner, right? So, that makes us vulnerable. But when Trump says that all aid to South Africa is stopped, right? The sense of that is, like a huge kind of crisis. The reality is that the bulk of American aid to South Africa was in the South African HIV/AIDS program. Of that program, the USAID program called PEPFAR has funded about 17% of the national HIV/AIDS program in South Africa. And 17%, which doesn't go to government, it goes to NGOs in the main. The consequence of that has been quite bad. So there's about 10 to 12,000 health workers in South Africa who now have no income, working for NGOs. But let me say that in 2002, PEPFAR made up 100% of South Africa's AIDS budget, HIV/AIDS budget. Now it's 17%. So we can actually do without it. We won't. Our AIDS program won't collapse. Okay. The other issue that keeps getting raised, and this got raised before 2023, before the ICJ case, in 2022, when South Africa took a position on the Ukraine war, we were threatened, and there was a discussion in Congress about whether South Africa should be kicked out of the African Growth and Opportunities Act benefits. That got raised more strongly even after the ICJ case by Republicans in Congress, and then it went quiet for a while. That AGOA comes up for renewal this year. I think it's in September. And so it'll be relooked at, redefined perhaps, and decision taken on which countries will benefit or not benefit from it, right? So South Africa potentially could be kicked out of that. What will that mean for South Africa? So the African Growth and Opportunities Act means that we're able to export a number of items to the US without tariffs, all of those kinds of things. What it'll mean for South Africa is that there are certain products of ours, particularly motor cars that are assembled here and exported to the US, which will suddenly become more expensive in the US. There's fruits and vegetables that we export to the US that will suddenly become more expensive in the US, and that will affect our trade, right? That's the reality. But not all our exports to the US fall under AGOA. Number one, this is why she's regarded as an enemy of the right wing in the US. She's trying to push my computer off the table. Not all our products or our exports fall under AGOA. And secondly, that American businesses that have interest in South Africa, either investments or they import from South Africa, have quietly said to South African business people and others that they are already working on how they might be able to circumvent any negative impact of that. The fact is that many of these businesses see the benefit from South Africa. So, for example, about a dozen of the critical minerals that the US imports a good part of it comes from South Africa. So 98% of the chromium ores that the US imports are from South Africa. 37% of the platinum comes from South Africa, etc. Right? And it's not the government that imports this; it's these companies, and so they don't want to, put that at risk. So yes, there will be. We are vulnerable. There will be negative repercussions. But we don't believe that it will be so substantial that it will damage our economy greatly. Brookings' report from 2023, just 2 years ago, concluded that if South Africa were deprived of AGOA benefits, the impact on our GDP will be 0.06%.
Thank you for this. This is very interesting. And,
Right.
we rarely see things in perspective that way. And I wanted to ask you, Naeem, because the first time we met, it was years ago. And I remember you here, giving us very powerful speech on resistance. And you said something that is rarely acknowledged about South Africa, that we must clarify what kind of resistance we are talking about when we speak about the anti-apartheid struggle. You pointed out that the West has, in a sense, whitewashed South Africa's struggle. This happened to Italian resistance too, erasing the role of armed resistance and the fight on the ground. So how do you see that in comparison to the narrative that the West is trying to impose on the Palestinian resistance?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I no longer am able to travel to the US for the past 20 years, more than 20 years. But when I was able to, there as well as in South Africa, I would get these young Zionists who were not even born, some of them in 1994, who would say things like, if only the Palestinians followed Mandela's example and engaged in peaceful struggle. Well, firstly, who the hell are you to tell the people that you are oppressing how they should conduct their struggle? But secondly, for God's sake, don't insult Mandela. Right, and I often say, my brother, when he was found dead on the streets in Durban, he wasn't lying there with a banner that said, peaceful resistance. There was an AK-47 next to his body. So don't insult my brother either. This notion that South Africa won our liberation and it was very clean and peaceful, and no. Mandela wasn't Gandhi. Mandela was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment because he was the founder of Mkhonto weSizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, not because he carried a white banner, right? Yes, the role, we must put into perspective, the role of armed struggle in South Africa, it was much less important than armed struggle in the Palestinian context. It was largely kind of sabotage operations, those kinds of things. But we never said that it didn't play a role, or we never said that it doesn't have a role. Armed struggle is a tactic. If it fits into a broader strategy of struggle, then it must be employed. And this is not just me saying it as a South African. This is the right given to all colonized people and occupied people under international law. I mean, there are numerous resolutions of the United Nations that occupied people and colonized people, different resolutions, have a right to resist, even by armed means, or by whatever means necessary. I mean, this is not my words, not Malcolm X. This is international law, right? And so the notion that Palestinians should only confine their resistance to quote unquote peaceful means is not something that is acceptable under international law, number one. Number two, the notion that you have the kind of colonialism, as brutal as it is in the Palestinian context, and the only recourse that those colonized people have is to boycott, is ridiculous. I mean, it's unjust, unfair, and ahistorical. Look at all the colonial struggles. which colonial struggle was won without any armed action, without any or without people saying that they have the recourse to armed action if they wanted to do so. So that this reinterpretation and re-narrating the South African history is a big insult to us. The ANC famously, in one of its conferences while it was in exile, laid out a kind of strategy for liberation, and spoke about the four pillars of resistance, the four pillars of struggle, rather, in South Africa. One of those four pillars, so the first one was mass mobilization, right? The second one was the international solidarity and international isolation of the apartheid state. The third one was the underground movement in South Africa. And the fourth one was armed struggle, right? The setting up of armed resistance. But let me also say, and so the armed struggle part, the MK in the case of Mkhonto we Sizwe in the case of the ANC, the Azanian People's Liberation Army in the case of the PAC, etc., played a smaller role in this. But let me also say that in terms of the underground movement in South Africa, in terms of the mass mobilization in South Africa, these were also not peaceful things. I mean, we had in the 80s this decade of what we call now rolling mass action. We had by the end of the 80s in places in South Africa that we regarded as liberated zones, as no-go zones for the South African Defense Force. Of course, we could say that because we knew that they wouldn't drop bombs on us like they do in Gaza or even in the West Bank now. But these were areas that we said were controlled by street committees and area committees, etc. And in these areas, people who were councillors appointed by the apartheid government were killed. I mean, these are not all things that we're necessarily proud of. People were identified as collaborators and were, the term we use, necklaced. I mean, this is something that many of us opposed, right? You had a tire put around the neck and set on fire because they were regarded as collaborators. Now, I always oppose this because I think it's an unjust way of doing it. But this is our struggle. This is the legacy of our struggle. We didn't take on this struggle to kind of just be peaceful and hope that the apartheid government would have a change of heart. We forced the government into that. And so by the end of the 80s, the reason that the negotiations began was two things. One was the international isolation, which was biting deep. And secondly, was that the government was losing control within the country, not because of Mkhonto we Sizwe and UPLA, but because of struggles on the ground, where policemen were getting killed, soldiers were, etc., right? Getting killed, getting attacked, because that was part of our struggle. And that is part, some of it we're not proud of, as I say, but as a whole, that is our legacy, that is our heritage that led to our liberation. And people like my brother were killed in that process. And that also is part of our pride.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naeem, for this. It's extremely important to kind of have this, that kind of contextualization of the struggle in South Africa, so we can move beyond cliches and whitewashing and talk about reality and history the way it was, as opposed to the way we kind of want it to be, and also to kind of listen this kind of constant sense of judgment on the Palestinians as if they are the deviation from all of these historical experiences. Our readers and viewers who are interested in this discussion in particular, they can go back to our previous podcast with international law expert Professor Richard Falk, who spoke about the issue of resistance and armed resistance, in particular under international law. Although I think Naeem has done a brilliant job in enunciating this particular issue. Just to finalize,
can I just say one thing
yes,
more
of
about
course.
this, Ramzi? I wrote an article for a journal which was based on an interview with another friend of yours, Ramzi, Ronnie Casserols. And the article looks at politics, non-violence, and violence in the struggle for liberation in South Africa. And in the interview, which didn't make it into the article because the article wasn't supposed to be about Palestine, but in the interview, which I will publish, the raw version of the interview on the internet, Ronnie makes the point quite clearly. So he talks about the South African struggle and the interplay between politics, violence, armed struggle, and non-violent action. And for him, these all three are indispensable for the political struggle. The struggle is political, but these are all the means available to it. And then, in the interview, he also makes the point that this is the same in the Palestinian context. That in fact, in the Palestinian context, the violence part has a bigger role, etc. And so it's called, I think, Politics, Violence, and Non-Violence in the Struggle for South Africa, a conversation with Ronnie Kasrils. But he makes that point very strongly.
And where can this article be accessed?
On my academia page.
Okay, we'll find it and we'll link it to in the comment section so that readers can read it and interact with it. Just one final question, unless Romana, you want to jump in.
No, you can go ahead.
So basically, if we could just look at Africa as a continent here in terms of its relationship with Palestine. We know that the very definition of Zionism as a racist ideology was adopted. It was adopted by the United Nations, but that only happened after the Organization of African Unity, I believe in 1975, kind of adopted that position, recognizing Israel as a form, Zionism as a form of racism, and linking that to the anti-apartheid movements underway in Africa at the time. What do you think are the chances of rekindling that African solidarity, especially now because of what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank? Not only in the context of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, but as a reliable and sustainable political position that could challenge Israeli colonial ambitions in Palestine, in the Middle East, and in the continent as a whole. And I know we only have few minutes, and this is a kind of a complex question to unpack, but if you could help us understand where we are here in terms of Africa's solidarity with Palestine.
So Ramzi, I'd like to be romantic about my people, but it's difficult to be. In the context in the mid-70s when that resolution was adopted was very different from now. So at that time, South Africa was not liberated yet. Namibia was not liberated yet. Zimbabwe was just getting there. And all three of these countries had armed struggles, and their armed groups had relations with the PLO, with the IRA, and others. So there was a sense of a common struggle among Palestinians and Africans at that time, that it was all part of one kind of anti-colonial struggle. Now we're looking at a slightly different context, a context where there's a few factors here. One is that many of these African countries, the elites look out for themselves. If we had an apartheid state in South Africa now, I'm not sure how many African countries would support the struggle, because you've got established elites that would kowtow to the US in order to get benefits for themselves. There are many of those, and this is why the issue of Israel's observer status in the AU is still up in the air, because there's a substantial number of states that will support that. Right, and a number of states that are very pro-Western, pro-American. So uniting the continent behind this is more difficult now. And then there's another very important factor that we shouldn't minimize, and that is the role of the church. So firstly, of course, there's Christian Zionism. Lots of American money coming into evangelical churches in South Africa that form part of a kind of global Christian Zionist movement. but also with that Christian Zionist narrative, even mainline churches being much more careful, right? So that is a challenge that wasn't there in the 70s, is here now, and is something that Africans need to take on and are taking on. So right now, for example, the South African BDS coalition, as part of the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, has organized a speaking tour for someone who's the head of the Evangelical Alliance in South Africa, who is an anti-Zionist, going around the continent speaking about this mistaken notion that Christians should support Israel. So the factors are the environment has changed a lot. There are lots of greater challenges now for that than previously, and I'm not sure that we would win that in the African Union right now. The fact that we have it in the African Charter for Peoples and Human Rights is something we've not exploited enough. We need to use that charter much more. That Zionism is a threat, that it's racism, etc. It's there, and it should be used by African states, by African civil society to make a point. But if we were to take a vote in the AU right now, I'm afraid we might lose. And so we need to be much more strategic about it.
This wasn't planned, Naeem, so do forgive me this question, but I would like to finish with this, and if you could just address it extremely, like within less than a minute, if possible. Um, the activists of South Africa are really, I don't think they get enough credits, but every time I go to South Africa, I feel greatly inspired by the degree of solidarity with Palestine and how radical, rightly so, they need to be regarding the situation in Palestine. We're talking about the genocide. If you're not radical in the times of genocide, you really have no business being in the solidarity business. But that said, what do the solidarity movement of South Africa now want from the government after the fact that the government has done already a lot for Palestine? What is the next step you think should be for South Africa? And very briefly.
So there's a few things. One is in terms of trade. So after Colombia stopped exporting coal to Israel, South Africa is now the largest exporter of coal to Israel, right? That needs to stop. I mean, we are energizing, really, the genocide in some ways, right? That needs to stop. So the trade thing is then diamonds, of course. We send a lot of our diamonds to Israel for beneficiation. That needs to stop. So the trade thing is one area. The other area is that I said earlier on that we have the Jewish community in South Africa, the most Zionist community in the world, outside of Israel, right? And so as part of that, a number of young South Africans, Jews and others, go to Israel to fight in the occupation forces. Many of them have made videos of themselves now during the genocide. They need to be prosecuted when they come back to South Africa. And these two are two big things that the South African government needs to do, moving beyond all the plaudits that it receives for the ICJ case. Domestically, this needs to happen for the government to say clearly that we are on the side of right in terms of international law and in terms of domestic law.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Naeem, for taking the time to speak with us for this extremely informative interview. And I'm sure that our viewers and listeners will appreciate it very much. And for your unwavering dedication to justice in Palestine and around the world. To all of our viewers, we appreciate you tuning in. As many of you already know, the Palestine Chronicle is heavily censored on social media. The best way to push back against censorship is to engage directly with our content. So please like, share, comment, and follow. From me and my co-host, Romana, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of The Floodgate. Thank you.